Today at 6, Labour accuses ministers of leading the country into a long, bleak winter. It comes after ministers rejected their own scientists' advice on the pandemic. Documents show the experts wanted much tougher restrictions 3 weeks ago. A circuit breaker, they called it. Keir Starmer wants that now.
The government has not got a credible plan to slow infections. It has lost control of the virus, and it is no longer following scientific advice.
This pandemic remains a formidable threat. Our strategy is to suppress the virus, supporting the economy, education and the NHS until a vaccine makes us safe.
Another 143 deaths linked to COVID have been reported today. That's a 4-month high. Also tonight, Liverpool City region goes into the top tier of restrictions tomorrow. We're there talking to the officials trying to hold back this second wave. The UK unemployment rate hits a 3-year high, with hospitality venues hit hard. Young workers face a tough time.
And we will make America great again. Thank you, Florida.
He's back on the campaign trail after COVID. Donald Trump travels to the key state of Florida. A £1 million Facebook like for the Bletchley Park Museum. The Wartime Code-Breaking Centre saw key advances in computing.
And coming up in sport on BBC News, we hear from the EFL teams warning that some clubs could disappear within 5 to 6 weeks unless they get financial support.
Good evening and welcome to the BBC's News at 6. Today, Labour has put clear water between the government's strategy on coronavirus restrictions and its own position. In a statement in the last hour, the Labour leader, Keir Starmer, accused the government of losing control of the pandemic. It follows confirmation that Boris Johnson rejected the advice of his own scientists who called for a near-total shutdown to hold back a second wave. Minutes from a meeting of SAGE, the scientific advisory group, show they wanted a so-called circuit breaker 3 weeks ago and warned of catastrophic consequences if no action was taken. Tonight, Keir Starmer said he wanted a 2 or 3 week national shutdown now. Here's our deputy political editor, Vicky Young.
Coronavirus cases on the rise, hospitals under pressure. Liverpool faces new restrictions from tomorrow.
We've got the spirit scousers. We're not going to...
Households won't be allowed to mix, but shops, restaurants, schools, workplaces and some pubs will stay open. Some don't think this will be enough to get the virus under control. 3 weeks ago, the government's scientific advisers privately recommended what they called a national circuit breaker, a short period when all hospitality and leisure venues would shut. Ministers discussed the idea but rejected it. For months, the Labour leader has broadly supported the government's approach, but today that came to an end. Sir Keir Starmer said it was time to act decisively, and he had a direct message for the Prime Minister.
You know that the scientific evidence backs this approach. You know that the restrictions you introduced won't be enough. You know that a circuit break is needed now to get this virus under control. You can't keep delaying this and come back to the House of Commons every few weeks with another plan that won't work.
He says the test and trace system isn't working effectively, and that's hampering the return to normality. You're now talking about a return to a blanket national approach. Isn't this going to be a huge cost to the economy? And isn't it better to have a tailored approach for every single region?
I think the damage to the economy will be caused by weeks and months of the approach the government has set out. This will break the circuit, bring the R rate down.
In Wales, 17 areas are already under some extra local restrictions, but the First Minister wants an emergency meeting to discuss going even further.
I ask the Prime Minister for an extra special COBRA meeting specifically to discuss the circuit breaker idea.
Some senior ministers did argue for this circuit breaker idea, a short, sharp lockdown over half-term to try to stop the virus spreading. But they were overruled amid concerns about heaping even more damage on an economy already battered. Ministers admit there are difficult months ahead and in the Commons defended the approach they're taking.
Governments of all different stripe, political persuasion have all come to broadly the same conclusion, which is it is necessary to restrict socialising because that way we reduce the transmission with the least damage to education and the economy.
It's not surprising that
But many Conservative MPs disagree, pointing to the economic damage the restrictions are already causing.
we have to get the country back to work. We simply cannot go on bailing out businesses. We are going bankrupt.
There is no silver bullet, and without one, although difficult, we must learn to live with the virus. The continued peaks and troughs are unsustainable.
The Prime Minister is being pulled in different directions and there are serious repercussions to every decision he makes. Now, the government's decided to go for a local approach, getting input from council leaders and mayors. Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, is making the case for London to have tighter restrictions within days, but it is causing tension, that kind of decision-making. Now, the government isn't ruling anything out. It does want to avoid another national lockdown, and that's partly because it's proven very difficult to roll these restrictions back once they've been brought in, and they can't be sure how long this kind of circuit breaker might be needed for. Would it be just 2 to 3 weeks, or would it be far longer with all the damaging consequences that would bring? Boris Johnson is getting a lot of suggestions, but no one can be quite sure what exactly will work.
All right, Vicky, thank you very much. So, as we've heard, the government's own medical and scientific advisors were ringing the alarm bells weeks ago. Their clear aim was to get the R number below 1, the point at which the coronavirus will eventually stop spreading. Our medical editor, Fergus Walsh, takes a close look at what the scientists wanted.
The SAGE documents warned of catastrophic consequences unless rapid action was taken to bring the R number down. It's currently 1.2 to 1.5, which means every 10 infected people are passing the virus to between 12 and 15 others.
Strict measures we know will reduce the prevalence, and the danger of introducing measures that are not strict enough is they're still economically damaging and still damaging to personal freedoms, but the prevalence keeps rising.
The scientific advisors wanted a 2-week circuit breaker lockdown with an order for people to stay at home. They thought this would bring the R number below 1, but would have a short-term impact, perhaps reversing the epidemic by 28 days. One recommendation that has been introduced is that anyone who can should work from home. The scientists think this could reduce R by up to 0.4, and they believe the advice should remain in place indefinitely. SAGE also called for all university lectures and tuition to be moved online. They think that could reduce R by up to 0.5, but not if students remain in their term time accommodation. The scientists also wanted the closure of all pubs, restaurants, cafes, gyms, leisure centres and hairdressers. They say these would have a more modest impact on suppressing the epidemic. The SAGE committee warns that a circuit breaker would have negative impacts, especially on the poorest in society. Ministers will also be assessing the detailed economic consequences.
SAGE is advising them on the medical science, the epidemiology and the behavioural side of these things. They will also be taking into account economic questions. They'll be thinking about what the government and the country can afford, and they'll also be thinking about things from a political perspective.
Unless radical restrictions are imposed, SAGE warns there could be 3,000 hospital admissions a day in the UK by the end of the month, the same as the peak in early April. Their view is the action taken so far is simply not enough to rein in the virus. Fergus Walsh, BBC News.
So the latest official figures show a rise in new infections. 17,234 were recorded in the latest 24-hour period, up from just under 14,000 recorded yesterday. It means the average number of new cases reported per day in the past week is 14,973. Hospital admissions have also increased. On average, 658 people were being admitted every day over the past week. This number doesn't include Scotland. 143 deaths have been reported. That's people who died within 28 days of a positive COVID-19 test. It means, on average, in the past week, 82 deaths were announced every day, which takes a total number of deaths so far across the UK to 43,018. Well, our medical editor, Fergus Walsh, is here with me now. 143 deaths. These are very sobering figures, families behind every one of them.
Absolutely, George, and it's the highest number of daily deaths since June. Now, there is a lag in reporting deaths at the weekend, but nonetheless, the trend, sadly, in deaths is up. And I have to tell you that the number of deaths related to COVID are simply going to keep rising for now because they are built into the system. These are people who got infected several weeks ago, and we know the epidemic is doubling every 7 to 14 days. The question is, how high will they go? Now, back in early April, there were up to 1,000 deaths a day. We are not seeing deaths rising anything like the speed they were back in the end of March, but we face a long winter ahead. Now, the average age of those who die with COVID is 82. The average age of people going into intensive care is 60. And the concern is that if hospitals keep filling up with COVID patients, that will have a knock-on effect on non-COVID care. But then all the restrictions that are being taken have a damaging effect on the economy, on mental health, and an impact on society, which has to be factored in. There are only hard choices ahead.
All right, Fergus, thanks very much. Thank you. The government's new tiered system of alert for England comes into force tomorrow. Most of England will be put on the medium level, where the rule of 6 and 10 p.m. hospitality curfew will apply. Some areas will be put on the high level, which means there'll be no household mixing indoors, but the rule of 6 applies outdoors. The most severe level is very high. That means no mixing of households in an indoor or outdoor setting. Pubs and bars will close unless they provide a substantial meal. So far, the Liverpool City region is the only area being put on this highest tier. From there, our health editor Hugh Pym sent this report.
Liverpool's tourism is still going for now, but the city region's facing up to the most extensive restrictions of people's everyday lives in England. So how has the decision been reached, and why not Manchester and some other urban centres as well? One of the key issues is how many people are picking up virus infections.
If you look at the number of daily cases per 100,000 of population, here's what's been happening in Liverpool since the middle of September, the 7-day rolling average. And here's what's been happening in Manchester, slightly lower but rising sharply, and then with a bit of a downward trend over the last week.
The age of those who get the virus is important, with older people more likely to become seriously ill. Liverpool's demographics don't help here.
We're seeing widespread community transmission of the virus here in Liverpool.
The City Council health spokesman explained the problem they were facing.
Liverpool's age profile of people infected is across the different age groups, and it is moving up into the older population. Manchester's is still very much in the younger population, so consequently we're seeing sicker people who need much more medical intervention here in Liverpool.
Government officials have published this chart showing average COVID-19 patient numbers in major hospital trusts in Liverpool and Manchester going back to the end of March. It shows just how rapidly those numbers have gone up in the last few weeks in Liverpool.
Tighter restrictions are intended to protect the vulnerable and ease pressure on hospitals. But could they damage people's health in other ways, raising anxiety levels and leaving some feeling isolated?
It's that roller coaster effect again.
Sean lost his job during the lockdown and found that time very stressful. Easing of restrictions and a new job has helped, but now he's worried again.
I felt that anxiety coming back again, and it's almost like you go up the hill and you come down the hill and you go up and you come down, and you're just thinking whatever's next. And this could go on for a very, very long time, and it's gonna destroy a lot of people. It really is, especially in our area, Merseyside.
These are difficult and complex judgments. Decisions on restrictions are partly driven by what local communities will support. Nobody can yet be sure of the right remedy. Hugh Pym, BBC News, Liverpool.
One key element in the government's new three-tier system for tackling the pandemic is that only those caught in the toughest restrictions will qualify for financial support. But many businesses in the north of England and the Midlands are under Tier 2 measures. They argue that their income will still be affected, but they don't qualify for any government help. Our business correspondent Sarah Corker reports from Derbyshire.
On the edge of the Peak District, those living in the market town of Glossop are just hours away from tighter restrictions. The mood here, like the weather, is darkening.
If the restrictions don't reduce in the next few weeks, I'm going to have to let my staff go.
Tier 2 restrictions mean from midnight there'll be a ban here on households mixing indoors. Bar owner Gaz says trade will plummet.
Although not legally required to close, so therefore not entitled to any of the financial support that's been made available, it's highly unlikely that people are going to socialise. People won't come out, so we would have been better in Tier 3.
That's because businesses in Tier 3 areas forced to shut by law get additional help with wages and grants. Those in this middle zone don't.
Hi guys. Hi mate, how you doing? Yeah, good.
Picking up the empty beer kegs is Chris, who owns a local brewery.
There's less beer to sell, less beer getting drunk. We'll just have to reduce our overheads, cut everything back and just try and survive. We'll do online sales and that's pretty much all we can do.
Businesses in these Tier 2 areas fear they'll experience the worst of both worlds. Tighter restrictions, fewer customers, but no extra funding. And local leaders across the north of England have written to the government asking for more financial help for pubs and restaurants in these so-called middle zones. This cafe only opened in March and it's been a struggle to survive.
It's going to have a massive impact on us financially. We're literally any day from closing if we don't have the continued support of people coming through the door.
So you're that close to closing permanently?
Yeah.
Meeting up while they still can are best friends Lynn and Leslie.
I don't like it at all. Very tempted to break the rules, but I haven't.
It's all right saying two households shouldn't mix, but what am I supposed to do?
The government says it supported the hospitality sector with cash grants, VAT cuts and business rates holidays. But here in Glossop, limiting social contact will mean more economic pain. Sarah Corker, BBC News in North Derbyshire.
And the time is 17 minutes past 6. Our top story this evening. Labour attacks the government after documents show they did not follow their scientists' advice on the coronavirus pandemic. And coming up, an exclusive interview with the head of British Gymnastics about bullying and welfare allegations in the sport.
Coming up on Sports Day on BBC News, Cristiano Ronaldo is in isolation after the Portugal and Juventus forward tests positive for coronavirus. He says he's doing fine and is symptom-free.
Now, the impact of the pandemic continues to hit jobs. Latest figures show the UK unemployment rate has risen to its highest level for more than 3 years. The Office for National Statistics says the rate increased to 4.5% between June and August, with younger workers worst affected. Here's our economics editor, Faisal Islam.
Here in Harrogate, the music has stopped playing. Employers such as this nightclub operator, who had held out over firing workers, has now had to make the toughest of decisions.
It was without question the hardest professional decision I've ever taken in nearly 40 years in this industry. And the reason being, I've been through 2 or 3 recessions previously where we had to make staff redundant. This time we were in a position that we're having to tell people that we're going to lose their jobs because we simply weren't allowed by law to open. Not because the businesses weren't viable, not because the customers didn't want the product. They were sacrificing themselves for the public health agenda.
This is what's driving up rising joblessness. The unemployment rate at 4.5% is at a 3-year high, though still relatively low by international and historic standards. The number of redundancies was up over the same period by a record as the furlough scheme began to be unwound. Redundancies are at their highest level since the financial crisis. There were some silver linings. Government support in August helped see a surge in vacancies, and workers on company payrolls stabilised slightly up, still over 600,000 down on March. Joblessness has jumped and is set to surge further in the coming months. It is one side of a complicated and concerning balancing act between protecting lives and livelihoods. And whatever happens with lockdowns, this tightrope is here to stay over the coming months, and that means very tricky decisions on jobs for employers right now. The Governor of the Bank of England told MPs that some jobs won't return even after the pandemic.
It increases the importance of the need to ensure that people can move jobs, retrain, get new skills, get skills to match the direction in which the change is happening.
When the government say... Back in Harrogate, Kim, a back office worker in the nightclub business, fears even the new 2/3 wage support policy is not enough.
I can't pay a decreased amount of my bills. And how is my employer supposed to pay my NI and pension with no income?
How's it affected things generally?
I feel stressed all the time, and it's awful. It's not good for my well-being.
A three-way balancing act of lives, livelihoods and the limits of government support is now going to be with us for some months. Faisal Islam, BBC News.
A 29-year-old mother and her 3 young children have died in a crash on the A40 in Oxfordshire. Police said there was a collision near a bridge between Oxford and Cassington last night. An 18-month-old girl and the children's father were critically injured. Duncan Kennedy reports.
The accident was so serious, the A40 was closed for nearly 15 hours. When it reopened, debris from the impact was still visible. The family in their car were in collision with a lorry. The woman died together with 2 of her daughters, aged 8 and 4, and her son, who was 6. The children's father and another 18-month-old daughter are in a critical but stable condition in hospital.
We have specially trained family liaison officers with the family at the moment. But as you can imagine, this is a horrendous incident, and we'd ask that there's no speculation in relation to the investigation or the causes.
Officers say the driver of the lorry involved suffered minor injuries and is helping with their inquiries.
As the police continue their investigation here, local people in the Oxfordshire village where the family came from have expressed their sadness. The local parish church said everyone was raw and everyone was very upset. Police have appealed for dashcam footage from any driver who was near the accident and say their investigation will take some time. Duncan Kennedy, BBC News in Oxfordshire.
The chief executive of British Gymnastics has given her first interview since the sport became engulfed in the welfare and bullying allegations that we've been recently reporting on. Jane Allen said she will stand down from her position in December, but insists the move is part of her retirement plans. She's been talking exclusively to our sports editor, Dan Rowan.
For months now, British Gymnastics has been a sport in crisis amid a torrent of allegations of coaching abuse and a culture of fear. Now, finally, the woman presiding over the scandal has broken her silence. Under fire Chief Executive Jane Allen telling me she was leaving the organisation she's ruled for a decade.
I've been devastated by the allegations that have come forward in the last few months. I'll be retiring in December of this year.
And is this because of the crisis that has engulfed your organisation?
No, this has been part of a plan that myself and the board have put together in March.
You say it's your decision to leave now, but you must accept that your leadership's become toxic. There was no way you could stay.
No, I don't agree with that. I think that it's time at 65 years of age, after 10 years of working hard for British Gymnastics, for me to step aside now.
You haven't been pushed?
Absolutely not.
And you're not jumping before you were pushed?
Absolutely not.
A host of top British gymnasts have spoken out about the way their complaints have been handled. Allen will be gone by the time an independent review is completed, but today she finally said the words many had been calling for.
I would apologise to any athlete who feels that at any time that any of our actions have hurt them in any way. I feel devastated by what they've gone through. They've been very brave to stand up and speak out. I think the organisation's fallen short and there are things that as CEO I take full responsibility for.
Were you asleep on the job? Or were you just trying to cover it up? Which of those two?
I don't think either of those. I think that the organisation was working hard with its high performance program. I think that the athletes themselves at times didn't speak up when they felt that way. We need to look at the barriers and understand why they can't speak out. There needs to be a sports ombudsman, and if there was, then there'd be a place for athletes or coaches to go if they were aggrieved with any of the outcomes of their complaints.
For many, your legacy, sadly, will now be one not of medals but of misery. What would you say about that?
I have put everything I can into the sport, and whilst these last 3 months have been, as I said, devastating to me, I don't believe that should absolutely define the last 10 years.
British gymnastics will now hope for a brighter future, but that may require more than just today's departure. Dan Rowan, BBC News.
Donald Trump has hosted a large rally in the battleground state of Florida less than 2 weeks after he tested positive for coronavirus. The president told his supporters that he was now immune from the virus and that he felt powerful. Our North America editor John Sopel has more.
He's back, and oh, is he relieved to be on the road again, tossing out face masks. Perhaps an unusual choice, seeing as he wasn't wearing one, and neither was most of the audience, though probably just as well, seeing as what he expressed he wanted to do to them.
I feel so powerful. I'll walk into that audience. I'll walk in there, I'll kiss everyone in that audience. I'll kiss the guys and the beautiful women and everybody. I'll just give you a big fat kiss.
The president, after his stay in hospital and his treatment with powerful drugs, seemed none the worse for the experience. His main target in the hour-long speech, his Democratic rival, Joe Biden.
We have somebody running who's not 100%, he's not 80%, he's not 60%. We can't have this. As a country, we can't have it. Joe Biden.
The vast audience had queued for hours to see him. They all had to undergo temperature checks. The woman handing out face masks, though, wasn't so busy. And their devotion even making some of his burliest supporters emotional.
Looking forward to the rally?
Yes, absolutely, looking forward to it. This man's going to take us where we belong.
Back to where we belong.
Chokes me up.
Nobody except Donald Trump can make America great again.
We love Donald Trump.
Why?
Love him.
Why?
Everything about him. Everything. Best president in the history of the United States.
Come get a picture with Trump. It's the only thing that's free here.
And the traders in Trump-branded tat were delighted to see him back too.
I'm a general contractor by trade, do this for fun. It's become a very lucrative business, to say the least.
If you won elections just on the basis of how enthusiastic your supporters are, well, then Donald Trump would have it in the bag. But these people, no matter how keen they are, only get one vote. And the polls at the moment suggest that Donald Trump is well behind and he's running out of time to turn it round.
Donald Trump has told his team he wants to do a daily rally between now and the election. He still believes that 4 more years is within his reach. John Sopel, BBC News, Sanford, Florida.
The Bletchley Park Wartime Code-Breaking Centre in Milton Keynes has been given a £1 million funding boost from Facebook. The social media giant said its donation was in recognition of the site's legacy as the birthplace of modern computing. Joe Black reports.
Bletchley Park, the home of the codebreakers. The best of Britain's brains worked here, secretly decrypting German communications. Now there's a new fight to keep this story alive during the pandemic. For the museum suffering financially because of coronavirus, help has come in the shape of social media giant Facebook, who has donated £1 million.
95% of our income comes from visitors. We are operating at 50% of what we were the previous year. So that's left a £2 million hole in our budget. And of course, planning forward, we don't know when the pandemic's going to end. We're looking forward to how we survive through the winter into next year.
Bletchley Park is widely regarded as the birthplace of modern computing. The work done here by mathematician Alan Turing and his team of codebreakers is said to have shortened the war by 2 years and saved countless lives.
We've just been so impressed in how it's kept now
And with this extra funding that's going to be available, what they can do to make it even better would be amazing.
The Facebook money, combined with almost £500,000 from the government, offers some relief for Bletchley Park. But the Trust knows the pandemic and financial pressures it brings are far from over. Jo Black, BBC News.
And the weather now with Ben Rich. Hello, Ben.
Hi there, George. Thank you. Good evening. It's been a cool day for all of us, but in terms of the look of the weather, there have been some quite big variations out there. Grey skies, outbreaks of rain for a weather watcher in East Sussex. Contrast that with the Inner Hebrides. Beautiful blue skies overhead. This is the radar picture. It's turned into a pretty soggy evening across East Anglia and the southeast. We've got a band of rain stretching from northern England down into Wales. These various clumps of wet weather will just rotate their way westwards as we go through the night. Some decent clear spells as well. Temperatures generally between 5 and 8 degrees. Although some sheltered spots in the far north of Scotland will get very close to freezing. So tomorrow we're likely to start off with some showery rain across parts of southern Scotland, maybe clipping into Northern Ireland for a time. That will tend to fizzle. We'll see some further showers moving in from the North Sea across eastern England into the Midlands, perhaps getting into parts of East Wales, the West Country, maybe towards Merseyside as the day wears on. But away from these areas, quite a lot of sunshine, and despite a fairly brisk northeasterly breeze, it should feel just a little bit less cool than it has done today, with highs of 12 to 16 degrees. Now we look ahead to Thursday, a fairly quiet day weather-wise. Quite a lot of cloud feeding in from the east. That could produce the odd spot of rain. Equally, there'll be some sunshine, the best of that in western areas. But temperatures, if anything, taking a step backwards, 11 to 14 degrees. Now, as we head through Friday into the weekend, high pressure will try to hold on. I think it will be strong enough to fend off the influence of this area of low pressure for the time being. So Friday, the weekend, should be dry, often cloudy, rather cool, but a big change to come next week. It turns wetter, windier, but a bit milder. George.
Ben, thank you. And that's all from the BBC's News at 6, so it's goodbye from me. And on BBC One, we can now join the BBC's news teams where you are.